The rain hammered against the windshield as David Mitchell pulled into his driveway, the wipers barely keeping up with the November storm that had been battering the city for hours. Through the blur of water and darkness, he could see something that made him pause with his hand on the door handle. Across the street, under the flickering streetlight, a woman and a small child were standing in the downpour next to a pile of belongings, their silhouettes trembling against the storm. The woman was trying to shield the little girl with what looked like a soaked jacket, but it was a losing battle against nature's fury. David sat there for a moment, watching this scene unfold, knowing that whatever decision he made in the next few minutes would change everything. David Mitchell had learned to live with the sound of water dripping from broken pipes at 3 in the morning, but what he valued most was the predictability of his work and the stability it provided for his 10-year-old son, Tommy. Their small rental house on Maple Street wasn't much to look at, but the rent was manageable, and it was within walking distance of Lincoln Elementary, where Tommy attended the special education program that had been a godsend for his learning difficulties. That Tuesday evening, David had spent the day fixing a burst water heater downtown. As he drove through the violent storm, he found himself thinking about Tommy's parent-teacher conference scheduled for Friday. The familiar sight of his street usually brought relief, but tonight something was different. A large moving truck was parked at an angle across from his house, its hazard lights blinking weakly in the storm. What he saw made his stomach tighten with anger and disbelief. A heavy-set man in a rain slicker was shouting at a woman and child, gesturing aggressively toward a growing pile of furniture, getting thoroughly soaked in the storm. The woman appeared to be pleading with him, her hands clasped in desperate gesture. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, was clinging to her mother's leg, both of them already drenched to the bone. David had seen evictions before, but there was something particularly cruel about throwing a family out into a storm like this. The woman tried once more to approach the man, probably asking for just one more night until the storm passed, but he shook his head firmly and pointed toward the street. That's when David noticed the little girl stumble and almost fall, saved only by her mother's quick reflexes. The child was shivering so violently that David could see it from across the street, and that's when his decision made itself. He stepped out into the storm and found himself walking across the street toward the scene. The man in the rain slicker noticed him approaching and paused in his work. "Everything all right over here?" David called out, having to raise his voice over the sound of the storm. The man turned toward David with weary expression. "Private property matter. Nothing to concern yourself with, neighbor?" But David was already looking at the woman and child, taking in their soaked clothes, the little girl's blue lips, and the absolute terror in both their eyes. The woman was probably in her mid-30s, with dark hair plastered to her head and a face that might have been beautiful if it wasn't currently twisted with desperation. "Mom," David said, addressing her directly, "you and your daughter need to get out of this weather. My house is right across the street. You're welcome to wait there until this storm passes." The woman looked at him with surprise, as if kindness from a stranger was the last thing she'd expected. We couldn't impose," she started to say, but her voice was lost in a violent gust of wind. "It's not an imposition," David said firmly, then looked at the man in the rain slicker. "You've made your point here. Give them a few minutes to gather what they can carry and find shelter for the night." The man's expression hardened. "This is a legal eviction, properly served and executed. And I've got a moral compass and a dry house," David replied. "The storm's not going to last forever, but hypothermia can kill a child in less than an hour." Something in David's tone convinced the man that this wasn't worth a fight. "5 minutes," he called over his shoulder. "Then I'm finishing this job and leaving." Within minutes, they had salvaged what they could carry and were hurrying across the street toward David's house. As they reached his front door, the man in the rain slicker drove away, leaving the rest of their belongings to the mercy of the storm. "Towels are in the bathroom down the hall," David said, flipping on lights. I'll put on some coffee and see what we've got for hot chocolate. The woman was still standing in his entryway, dripping and looking around as if she couldn't quite believe where she was. "I'm Sarah," she said quietly. "This is my daughter Emma. I don't know how to thank you for this." "I'm David, and you don't need to thank me. Nobody should be out in weather like this, especially not with a child." Emma, who had been silent since they'd come inside, finally spoke up. "Is this your house?" "It is," David said, smiling at her. "I live here with my son Tommy, but he's at school right now for some extra help with his reading. He should be home in about an hour." As Sarah and Emma went to dry off, David found himself wondering what exactly he'd gotten himself into. The smart thing would probably be to help them find a motel for the night, but something about Sarah's desperation suggested that this wasn't a simple case of being behind on rent. There had been fear in her eyes that went beyond homelessness. When they emerged from the bathroom, considerably more human despite still wearing damp clothes, David offered them hot drinks. Emma went to explore his bookshelf while Sarah settled into a chair. "The storm's supposed to clear up by morning," David said. "We can figure out your next steps then." Sarah nodded, but tension remained in her shoulders. "We were supposed to be staying with Emma's father, but that didn't work out." There was clearly a story there, but David didn't push. Sometimes the most helpful thing was providing a safe space without asking too many questions. When Tommy arrived home from tutoring, he simply nodded at the introduction and began explaining his book collection to Emma. David watched the two children interact with easy familiarity and noticed Sarah relaxing as she observed her daughter finding a friend. Over the next hour, they fell into comfortable conversation. Sarah mentioned she used to teach elementary school, but had been between positions lately. Tommy convinced Emma to help with a jigsaw puzzle, and both children sprawled on the floor, absorbed in the task. "They're good kids," David observed. "Emma's been through a lot lately," Sarah said quietly. "It's nice to see her acting like a normal 7-year-old for a change." What David didn't expect was for Emma to ask to use the bathroom and Sarah to give directions that were surprisingly specific for someone who'd never been in the house before. It was easily overlooked, but it planted a seed of curiosity that would grow larger before the night was over. The first sign that this wasn't going to be a simple overnight stay came at breakfast the next morning. David had started coffee and was looking across the street at the scattered remains of Sarah and Emma's belongings when Sarah appeared, wearing one of his flannel shirts over her dress. "I hope you don't mind," she said, indicating the borrowed shirt. "Of course not. How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks. Emma's still asleep." They stood looking out the window at the storm's aftermath. "Where were you planning to go before yesterday happened?" David asked casually. Sarah's pause was just a beat too long. "I was hoping to find a temporary rental, something month to month until I could get back on my feet." It was reasonable, but David had spent enough time around people in crisis to recognize when someone was being carefully truthful rather than completely honest. After Tommy left for school, David prepared to head to work. "You're welcome to stay here for the day. I've got cable television, and Emma seems to have found plenty of books." "Are you sure? I hate to take advantage." "You're not. But I do have a question. Are you and Emma safe here? Is there anyone who might come looking for you who could pose a problem?" Sarah weighed her options carefully. "I don't think so, but I can't guarantee it." David explained his daily routine, gave Sarah his contact numbers, and showed her safety precautions. "If anything feels wrong, trust your instincts." He left for work that morning with the strange feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. The job was a complex repair that kept him busy for hours, but part of his mind remained on Maple Street. It wasn't until he was 3 hours into the repair that David's phone rang. Sarah's voice was tight with controlled panic. "David, I think we might have a problem. There's a man outside. He's been sitting in a black sedan across the street for the past hour, just watching the house." David immediately sat up, full attention on the call. "Can you see him clearly?" "I can't tell from this distance, but he's not from the neighborhood. He hasn't gotten out of the car or talked to anyone. He's just waiting." "Go to the back of the house, away from the windows. Take Emma with you, and call Mrs. Patterson. I'm calling the police and coming home." The black sedan was gone by the time David reached his street, but Mrs. Patterson's car in his driveway told him Sarah had followed instructions. He found all three of them in his kitchen. "He left about 10 minutes after I called you," Sarah said. "But not before he got out and walked around the house like he was checking all the exits." Mrs. Patterson looked genuinely concerned. "I've lived on this street for 40 years. I know every face in this neighborhood, and I've never seen that man before." David realized that whatever Sarah was running from was no longer theoretical. Someone was actively looking for her. "I think Emma and I should leave," Sarah said quietly. "I never intended to bring trouble to your door." "Where would you go?" David asked practically. Sarah's silence was answer enough. "You're not going anywhere. Not until we figure out what we're dealing with." The discovery came purely by accident that evening. While Sarah was helping Emma with homework, and David was fixing a cabinet door, wind scattered papers that had fallen from Sarah's purse. As David bent to collect them, he caught sight of a bank statement with a name that made his blood run cold. Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood. Blackwood, the same name as his mysterious landlord. David stared at the paper, his mind racing through implications. He gathered the papers without saying anything, but his hands were shaking as he handed them back to Sarah. She looked up and immediately noticed his expression, her face paling. "We need to talk," David said quietly. "Outside." On the back porch, David got straight to the point. "Blackwood, as in Edmund Blackwood, the man who owns this house." Sarah closed her eyes and leaned against the railing. "He's my father." Everything David thought he understood about the situation suddenly became more complicated and dangerous. "Your father is Edmund Blackwood, the real estate mogul who owns half the rental properties in this city, including this one. I recognized the address when you brought us here, but I didn't know how to tell you. So when you said you were running from someone dangerous, I was running from him, and from Richard Morse, the man my father wants me to marry." The name Richard Morse hit David like a physical blow. He knew that name from business pages, a wealthy developer and city council member with significant influence. "Why? What does your father gain?" Sarah was quiet for a long time. "Control. After my brother died last year, I became the sole heir to the Blackwood fortune. But there are conditions in my grandfather's will about family stability and appropriate marriages. If I marry Richard, my father maintains control through him. If I don't, and if something happens to me, Emma becomes the heir with my father as her guardian until she turns 25. David didn't need details about what Richard had done. The fear in Sarah's voice made it clear. "So the man watching the house today. Probably one of Richard's people. My father's been discreet about the search, but Richard doesn't care about discretion. There's something else you need to know." Sarah continued. "Your rent, the reason it's so much lower than market rate. My father doesn't do anything out of kindness. He's been keeping track of you, David. Your work history, Tommy's school records, your financial situation." David felt a chill. "Why?" "Because grateful tenants make useful tools. He has a whole network of people who owe him favors. He's been cultivating that relationship with you for 3 years. The implications were staggering. David's comfortable life had been an illusion, orchestrated by a man who saw human beings as chess pieces. "He's going to use that against us now," David realized. Sarah nodded miserably. "He'll contact you directly soon, offer incentives to turn us over, or threaten eviction if you don't cooperate." David thought about Tommy, about the stability his son needed, about the special education program and housing he could afford on his salary. What would happen if I did turn you over? Richard would take us back. He'd probably move us somewhere remote where I couldn't run again. Emma would grow up watching her mother be destroyed, and when she turns 18, she'd become Richard's next target. David stood there realizing he was facing the most important decision of his life. Everything he'd built for Tommy was now at risk because he'd chosen to help a stranger. "There's one more thing," Sarah said. "I have evidence, documents, recordings, financial records that prove what my father and Richard have been doing, not just to me, but to other people. Business deals achieved through blackmail, tenants evicted for not cooperating, women silenced after Richard assaulted them. Why haven't you gone to the police?" "Because half the police department owes my father favors, but there's a federal investigation starting, a task force looking into corruption in city development projects. If I could get the evidence to them, you could bring down your father and Richard both, and free myself and Emma. But I need time to make contact with the right people, and I need a safe place while I figure out how to do it without getting us killed." David looked at this woman who'd turned everything upside down and realized she wasn't asking him to choose between her family and his. She was offering him a chance to be part of something bigger. "How long would you need?" "Maybe a week. 2 at the most." David thought about Tommy, about the risks, about the possibility that everything could go wrong. Then he thought about Emma's smile and the kind of man he wanted his son to become. "Okay, we'll find a way to make it work." The call came exactly when Sarah had predicted it would. David was reading Tommy a bedtime story, Emma curled up listening to tales of brave knights, when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. "David Mitchell?" The voice was cultured, authoritative. "This is David. This is Edmund Blackwood. I believe you have something that belongs to me." David forced his voice to stay steady. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't insult my intelligence, David. You've been providing shelter to my daughter and granddaughter. I'm calling to discuss the terms of their return." The casual tone made David's skin crawl. "They're not property to be returned." "Aren't they? Let me explain your situation, David. You're a good man working hard to provide for his son. You rent a lovely house for significantly below market rate, which allows you to send Tommy to excellent special education services. Your lease comes up for renewal next month." David felt the trap closing around him. "I could simply evict you, force you to find alternative housing, which would be difficult on your salary. Tommy would have to change schools, leave his friends, adapt to a new program that might not be as effective." "Or," David prompted, "or you could be helpful. Convince my daughter to come home. In return, I'd extend your lease indefinitely, perhaps offer you an opportunity to purchase the house at a reasonable price. And if Sarah doesn't want to come home, then you'd be harboring a fugitive. Sarah took certain documents when she left. That's theft, David. Anyone who assists a thief becomes an accessory." David felt anger rise. "What documents? Your concern should be your son's welfare. Tommy's such a bright boy. It would be a shame if his education was disrupted by his father's poor judgment." "Don't threaten my son. I'm simply pointing out natural consequences of certain choices. You have until tomorrow evening to decide wisely." The line went dead. When David returned to the bedroom, Sarah took one look at his face and knew what had happened. Later, sitting at the kitchen table, Sarah said quietly, "He's right about one thing. Tommy would suffer if you lose this house. Are you suggesting I should turn you over? I'm suggesting that maybe Emma and I should disappear tonight before you have to make that choice." David looked at this woman, willing to sacrifice her safety to protect him and Tommy. "Where would you go?" "I don't know. Maybe a shelter. Maybe find another family willing to help." "There is someone. Us. We're going to finish what you started, Sarah." Over the next hour, Sarah laid out the evidence she'd discovered. Financial records showing bribes to city officials, recorded conversations detailing plans to force tenants out, photographs documenting Richard Morse's assaults. It's enough to put them both away for decades, but only if it gets to the right people. They were making plans when they heard footsteps on gravel outside. David immediately turned off the kitchen light and moved to the window. 3 men were moving systematically around his house, checking windows and doors with practiced efficiency. "Get Emma," David whispered urgently. "We're leaving. Now." They escaped through the back door, moving through neighboring yards to reach David's truck. As they drove away with headlights off, David could see flashlight beams inside his house. As he looked in the rearview mirror at Emma curled against Sarah, David realized his old life was over. The safe house was Mrs. Patterson's sister's cabin in the mountains, isolated and accessible only by dirt road. While Emma explored with childlike curiosity, David and Sarah planned their next moves. "I need to go back," Sarah said, "to where I hid the evidence. It's in a safety deposit box downtown." That's exactly what they'll be expecting. Then we'll have to be smarter than them. Their plan was audacious. David would walk into Blackwood's office and demand a face-to-face meeting while Sarah retrieved the evidence. It depended entirely on Blackwood's arrogance and assumption that David could be intimidated. The plan began at 2 o'clock when David walked through the front doors of Blackwood Industries as if he belonged there. He was wearing his best clothes and carrying a clipboard, relying on the truth that most people don't question someone who acts like they have a right to be where they are. 3 blocks away, Sarah was entering First National Bank, timing her approach with the shift change. Emma was safely with Mrs. Patterson at the library, surrounded by witnesses. "I'm here to see Mr. Blackwood," David told the receptionist. "Tell him David Mitchell is here about his daughter." The receptionist's professional smile wavered. "Do you have an appointment?" "He'll want to see me." Edmund Blackwood's office was designed to intimidate, with marble floors, expensive artwork, and panoramic city views. The man himself was smaller than David had imagined, probably 70+, with silver hair and an expensive suit. But his eyes were sharp and calculating. "David Mitchell," Blackwood said without getting up. "The heroic plumber who thinks he can save my daughter from herself. I'm the man who's going to stop you from destroying your own family," David replied. Blackwood smiled coldly. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. My daughter is troubled, and I'm trying to help her before she ruins her life completely. By forcing her to marry a man who abuses her? By threatening to take custody of her daughter? By protecting my family's interests and ensuring my granddaughter grows up with proper guidance, something you should understand as a single father." The threat was clear. "Leave my son out of this." "Your son is already part of this. The moment you interfered, you made Tommy a factor. The question is whether you'll be reasonable or whether we need to explore other options." David pulled out his phone, showing Blackwood a photograph Sarah had taken of documents. "I have a counter-proposal. You call off your people, leave Sarah and Emma alone, and forget you ever knew my name. In exchange, these documents don't find their way to federal investigators." Blackwood's hands tightened on his chair arms. "I assume my daughter shared her fantasies about having evidence of wrongdoing?" "These aren't fantasies," David replied, showing another photo. "These are bank records, recorded conversations, and photographic evidence that would put you and Richard Morse in federal prison." For the first time, Blackwood looked genuinely surprised. "Where did you get those?" "Sarah's already made contact with the federal task force investigating corruption in city development. In about 2 hours, they're receiving copies of everything, along with her sworn testimony." It was a bluff based on enough truth to be believable. David watched Blackwood's face, looking for signs the older man was beginning to doubt his position. "Even if such evidence existed," Blackwood said carefully, You have no guarantee federal investigators would act. I have friends at every level of government. Maybe. But you can't control everyone. All it takes is one honest investigator, and your empire comes crashing down. Blackwood walked to the window, looking out at the city he'd controlled for decades. When he turned back, his expression was more dangerous. Let me tell you about evidence, Mr. Mitchell. Evidence can be discredited. Witnesses can be impeached. Federal investigators can find their funding reduced. The system you think will protect you is made up of people, and people can be influenced. Maybe. But Sarah's not the only witness, and she's not the only person with access to evidence. You might silence one person, but can you silence everyone? What exactly are you proposing? Sarah and Emma disappear. New identities, new location, complete freedom. In exchange, the evidence stays buried. Blackwood considered this. And you'll guarantee the evidence won't surface later. My word. And the knowledge that exposing you wouldn't benefit us if we're safely out of reach. Blackwood was genuinely considering the proposal when his expression hardened. There's one problem. You're assuming I care more about avoiding prosecution than maintaining control of my family's legacy. David's heart sank. You'd rather go to prison than let Sarah go free. I'd rather take my chances with investigators than let my daughter disappear with evidence that could be used against me for years. You see, this isn't about money or power. It's about family. The way Blackwood said family made David's skin crawl. This was about ownership, not love. Sarah will never come back willingly. Children adapt. Emma will learn to appreciate being part of a powerful family. As for Sarah, her willingness is less important than her compliance. David realized they'd reached an impasse. Then we're done here. We're done when I say we're done, Blackwood replied. The office door opened and two large men entered. My associates are going to escort you to a more private location where we can continue our discussion. David's plans were crumbling, but he remembered Sarah's words about her father's greatest weakness, his arrogance. Before your friends lay a hand on me, David said loudly, you might want to know that this conversation is being recorded and transmitted live to several people very interested in what you have to say. It was a complete lie, but David delivered it with conviction. You're bluffing, am I? David asked, showing his phone screen. Sarah learned about surveillance equipment during her years documenting your crimes. Did you think we'd walk into this meeting without backup? Doubt flickered in Blackwood's eyes. Even if that were true, it wouldn't change that you're in my building, surrounded by my people. You're right, but you're missing the bigger picture. This was never about me getting out safely. This was about buying time for Sarah to do what she needed to do. David showed Blackwood a text message. Package delivered. Mission accomplished. For the first time, Edmund Blackwood looked like a man who might have been outplayed. What package? Copies of every document, every recording, every piece of evidence Sarah collected, delivered directly to the federal task force, along with her sworn testimony and contact information for witnesses. The silence was absolute. You're lying. Call the FBI field office. Ask to speak to Agent Jennifer Martinez about the Blackwood investigation. David was gambling on a name Sarah had mentioned, hoping there really was such an investigator. Blackwood weighed his options. Even if you've given them evidence, investigations take years. You and Sarah and Emma are still vulnerable to accidents that happen to people who make powerful enemies. Maybe, but federal investigators take a dim view of people who threaten potential witnesses. Any accidents now will only strengthen their case against you. What do you want? Sarah and Emma's freedom, complete freedom, with no further contact from you or Richard Morse. And in exchange, nothing. The evidence is already with investigators. Sarah's testimony is on record. You get nothing except knowing that if you honor the agreement, Sarah won't actively cooperate with prosecution. Blackwood struggled with the realization that his world was collapsing. "You have no idea what you've started, the forces you're playing with, the people whose interests you're threatening." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before treating your daughter like property." Blackwood sat down heavily, suddenly looking his age. "Get out, all of you." David headed for the door. As he reached it, Blackwood spoke once more. "This isn't over, Mr. Mitchell." "Yes, it is. Because if anything happens to any of us, the FBI will know exactly where to look first." David walked out feeling like he'd just defused a bomb with seconds to spare. As he rode the elevator down, he allowed himself to hope they'd actually pulled it off. 3 months later, David stood in the kitchen of a small house 2 states away, making pancakes while Tommy and Emma argued about toppings. The house was rented, furnished with second-hand finds and new purchases, but it was theirs in all the ways that mattered. The federal investigation had moved quickly. Within 6 weeks, both Edmund Blackwood and Richard Morse had been arrested on charges ranging from bribery and extortion to witness intimidation. The local news had covered it extensively, describing it as one of the largest corruption cases in the city's history. Sarah had testified before a federal grand jury, her identity protected by witness security protocols. The prosecution was so confident they'd offered plea bargains to lesser conspirators, building overwhelming evidence that made conviction almost certain. Tommy had adapted with his characteristic resilience. The new school district had an excellent special education program, and he was already making friends and showing improvement. Most importantly, he seemed to understand their move had been necessary for everyone's safety. Emma was flourishing in ways that broke David's heart when he thought about her previous life. She laughed freely now, asked questions without fear, and had developed a close friendship with Tommy that reminded David daily why he'd made his choices. Sarah was still healing from years of abuse and fear, but she'd found work as a substitute teacher, and David could see her confidence returning gradually. They'd talked about the future tentatively, acknowledging growing feelings while being careful not to rush anything that might complicate the children's adjustment. The legal proceedings continued, but the worst was behind them. David had found work with a local plumbing company whose owner appreciated his experience without asking too many questions. For the first time in years, David felt like he was building something sustainable rather than just surviving. "Dad?" Tommy said, "Emma wants to know if we can go to the park after breakfast." David looked at Sarah, who was sitting with coffee and the newspaper, more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. "What do you think?" "I think that sounds perfect," Sarah replied, smiling at both children, "but only if you finish breakfast first." As David watched the children negotiate park visit terms, he marveled at how normal this felt, how much it resembled the family life he'd always wanted but never quite managed to create. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was better than anything he could have imagined. The newspaper carried a small item about Blackwood's latest court appearance, describing how the once powerful businessman had been denied bail. Reading it, David felt no satisfaction, only profound relief that the man could no longer hurt people he cared about. There were still challenges ahead. Sarah was working through trauma that would take years to heal, and both children were adjusting to enormous changes. David himself was learning to trust in a future not shadowed by fear, something more difficult than expected after years of survival mode. But as he flipped pancakes and listened to his family preparing for another ordinary day, David felt genuine contentment. Not temporary satisfaction, but deep peace that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged, with exactly the people who mattered most. Tommy finished his pancakes and ran for his jacket, followed by Emma explaining her elaborate park plans. Sarah stood to clear the table, pausing to squeeze David's shoulder, a gesture that conveyed everything they felt but weren't ready to say aloud. "Ready for another adventure?" Sarah asked, and David could hear in her voice the confident, hopeful woman she was becoming. "Always," David replied, reaching for his jacket. With you and these kids, I'm ready for anything." As they walked towards the front door, David took one last look around their small kitchen, memorizing this moment when everything felt possible and nothing felt threatened. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but today was perfect in its simplicity and safety. They stepped into spring sunshine together, a family formed not by blood, but by choice and circumstance, heading toward a park where children could play without fear and adults could watch with hearts full of hope. It was an ordinary moment that felt extraordinary because of how hard they'd fought to make it possible. The story that had begun with a stranger's kindness during a storm had become something none of them could have predicted, a testament to the power of ordinary people to protect each other, to stand up against those who abuse power, and to build new lives from the ashes of old fears. Walking down the quiet street toward the park, David realized he'd learned something important. Heroes weren't people with special powers. Heroes were people who chose to help when help was needed, who stood up when standing up was dangerous, and who protected the vulnerable even when it cost them everything. He'd never wanted to be a hero, but when the moment came, when Sarah and Emma needed someone to stand with them, David had discovered reserves of courage he hadn't known he possessed. Now, watching Tommy and Emma run toward the playground while Sarah walked beside him in comfortable silence, David understood that the greatest victory wasn't defeating Edmund Blackwood. The greatest victory was this: the four of them walking together toward a future they'd created through their choices, free to become whoever they wanted to be. The rain had stopped, the storm had passed, and the sun was shining on a new day full of ordinary miracles and simple joys. For a single father who'd started this journey just trying to fix other people's broken pipes, it was more than enough. It was everything.